Good evening, everyone. You know, I'm not even going to use this.
If you're in my intro class, you know I don't need to use that mic. So good evening, welcome to the presentation that we have going on tonight. I'm Rachel Hamill. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Mass Media, and I'm very excited to have our speaker here tonight to talk about storytelling from several different angles, but from the radio side of things and especially from the podcast side of things. If we've taken, I don't know if anybody's in here that's taken my digital multimedia class, but we just finished a unit on podcasting. So I know that it's something that we want to be talking about here at MSU for mass media. And I have loved podcasts for a long time, and I think everyone in this room should listen to podcasts all the time. So I'm going to kind of try to spread that gospel, as I'm sure Reham's going to try to spread that gospel as well. I was listening to them probably back in 2007. I had an old MP3 player. It wasn't even an iPod. It was like Sony or something like that. And I was that nerd who was out there on runs, and I never listened to music during my runs. I listened to podcasts. And I still do that today. I have a little bit more music on my iPod, but I find that that's a great time to listen to podcasts and in the car as well. So if you haven't ever listened to them, I think that you will have a great one to start with tonight to try to get a feel of what that is. Before we start with our speaker tonight, we take this opportunity to recognize that we live, work, and learn in the homeland of the Dakota people, and whose language frames our name, Minnesota State University, Mankato. Reham Fashir is a reporter with Minnesota Public Radio News. She attended the University of Minnesota's journalism program, where she specialized in print journalism and reported for the Minnesota Daily. After graduating in 2008, Reham worked for newspapers owned by Forum Communications in Greater Minnesota and in the Twin Cities. Reham came to MPR 3 years ago, where she started as an evening general assignment reporter chasing breaking news. She quickly jumped into coverage of police shootings in the Twin Cities and the aftermath of those high-profile incidents, including the shooting of Jamar Clark and the Minneapolis 4th Precinct occupation that followed. She reported on marches, protests, and highway shutdowns, along with other enterprise stories related to various topics, including mental health and vulnerable adults. In July of 2016, another high-profile police shooting took place in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. The aftermath of that shooting was broadcast live on Facebook for millions to watch. Reham covered the story of the shooting of Philando Castile and followed the investigation until charges were filed against the officer, Geronimo Llanes. Reham was one of 2 reporters who covered the trial of Officer Llanes for MPR News and the podcast 74 Seconds. The podcast told the story of the shooting, the trial, and the trial's aftermath. The podcast examined legal nuances of the case and the stories of the characters involved. It provided context, depth, and analysis on a topic many people across the country were interested in. Currently, Reham is reporting on immigration issues in Minnesota, and with that, let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me here today. Like Rachel said, my name is Reham Fashir. I'm a reporter for Minnesota Public Radio. I cover all kinds of different things, but right now I'm trying to focus more on immigration issues. I co-hosted the podcast 74 Seconds, which I'll tell you more about, with an amazing team who helped make it the successful product that it was. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I went into journalism because I liked writing. I loved storytelling, and the more I got into the research and reporting side of things, the more I loved it even more. This is cliche, but I wanted to tell the stories of people that I meet. I wanted to discover new things. I wanted to have meaningful conversations. So I went to the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities campus, where I majored in journalism and mass communication with a focus in print journalism. And the best decision I made there was to work for the Minnesota Daily. I learned so much there. There was a lot of opportunity to take multimedia classes and learn from the people that taught at the University of Minnesota, but I really got a real-world experience working at the Minnesota Daily. learned the inner workings of a newsroom, editing, writing, reporting. It was really top priority for a lot of us on campus who worked at the Daily, but sometimes it got into our schoolwork, but we didn't really let it hinder our grades or anything like that. Then I graduated in 2008, and I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember how bad it was in 2008. The economy was pretty bad, and especially for newspapers all across the country, newspapers were cutting staff all over. So it was a really tough time to graduate from a journalism school. I looked for jobs, and it wasn't easy to find something right away. So I moved up to Park Rapids, Minnesota, a small town, and I covered small town politics. I covered just small town life, schools, and a lot of different festivals. But it was really valuable experience. I got to learn a lot of different things again. I learned about photography, I learned about newspaper design, I learned about reporting on a variety of different issues. You become an expert in pretty much everything when you're working for a small town paper. And then from there, I just transferred through the company, through different newspapers, and I worked in Detroit Lakes. I worked for Farmer Forum sometimes, and we partnered with the Pioneer Press, and we shared news articles that way when they were cutting staff and we were cutting staff. So it was nice to share news from all over the state in those different newspapers. And then I moved back down to the Twin Cities, and I worked for suburban newspapers. Then the opportunity at MPR came up, and I started there as a digital reporter, meaning I focused on the website. I wrote exclusively for the website for the first couple of years. And then from there, I was chasing all kinds of different things as a general assignment reporter, especially in the evening. So much happened during the couple years that I had that position. From making calls on the latest, emerald ash borer or zebra mussel discovery, to weather, to really tense protests in the Twin Cities that were happening at that time. So there was a lot of freeway shutdowns, there was a lot of tense standoffs with police. So I covered some of that, and that's how I kind of got into covering police shootings that were happening. But over the past couple of years, the focus of the job has changed. And that's because in this day and age, you have to do it all as a reporter. I was hired as a print journalist, but I was still gathering tape from all of my events and all of my interviews. So it wasn't right to not use the tape that I was getting for more than just 1 minute on the radio. The stories that I was doing online weren't getting as much coverage and exposure as full-time radio reporter stories. So I wanted to do more, and I wanted to be able to get that tape on the air. And I also wanted to do a lot more enterprise work, meaning covering stories for the radio and the web, but getting the coverage that they deserve on the radio as well as on the website. And it's why we go into journalism, right? To bring awareness to an issue, to do unique enterprise, to try and make impact. So from there, I transitioned into radio. I slowly transitioned into radio. I tapped into a lot of the resources that we had at MPR. I sought help from a lot of people who were experienced on producing and writing for radio and voicing. So in the beginning, it wasn't an easy transition. I obsessed about how I sounded all the time. Did I speak clearly enough? Did I sound authoritative? Meaning, old enough for people to really believe what I was saying. So I realized at the end that the key thing was confidence. It really, at the end of the day, what matters is you reporting and the stories that you're telling, and not the way a reporter sounds. So it was more important for me to focus on the reporting than the way I sounded. It's not to say that, it's not important to improve how I sounded on the radio, but at the end of the day, like I said, it's the reporting. Covering a story for radio is slightly different than covering a story for print. In radio, you need good tape. You need to talk about the complicated issues of the system through human stories. Otherwise, the stories are not engaging enough, and people won't listen. Lots of numbers in radio don't sound good. They don't make for good radio stories. Institutional jargon that you see in press releases, that doesn't sound good either. So with that, I have an example here of a story that I worked on when I first transitioned from print to radio.
Oh, that was a seizure. Did you see how he kind of rolled his eyes? Hey, buddy.
4-year-old Wyatt Hauser is sitting down for lunch. Some ham, bananas, and blueberries. His mother, Jessica Hauser, mixes in a small dose of not-so-tasty cannabis medicine with his applesauce.
And he gets significantly less of the green because it's got a higher THC content, but he needs a little THC to help with his seizures.
Wyatt was the first patient to register for Minnesota's medical cannabis program last year. After dealing with seizures since he was an infant, his mother, Jessica Hauser, fought pretty hard to help get the law passed. While most patients report seeing benefits from the drug, others are still having a hard time finding a doctor who would certify them. Many say it's too expensive, so they end up getting marijuana off the black market.
So I have tents here in my backyard that I work out in, and I smoke my cannabis in.
Janessa Lee has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a collagen disorder that affects her joints, skin, and blood vessels. She finds smoking marijuana helps with the pain. She's been able to exercise again and do her physical therapy. Lee qualified for the state program a year ago under monthly hours, but she doesn't plan to renew her enrollment.
So this story was about Minnesota's medical marijuana program and how it was doing after its first year of becoming a law. For some people it was great, for others it was too expensive. So it could have easily been a bunch of numbers and how things were going, but we found the people that were involved and were affected by the law. It started with a 9-second clip of ambient sound, which I later found out that was too long for radio, but it was powerful. One of my colleagues complimented me on the stories and told me that most editors wouldn't allow for that, but I can see why you guys chose to do it this way, because it was pretty powerful. And my response was, that's what they get for letting a rookie radio reporter do this. So, like writing, if you want to become a better writer, you read a lot of news articles, you read a lot of different things, nonfiction. To improve as a radio reporter, you just have to listen to a lot of different things. There's so much out there that we can listen to and learn from. I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of public radio, and just in general, a lot of audio stories that really help us improve our work and inspire us to do more. And with that, I'll tell you guys about the podcast that we created for MPR News called 74 Seconds. And we'll start with one clip that gives you an idea of what the story was all about.
This is the story of a traffic stop. It's July 6th, 2016, in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. It's hot, humid, the kind of weather that makes you want to roll your windows down, let the breeze in.
Falcon Heights is a suburb outside Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's a mostly white town of bungalows and ramblers and fewer than 6,000 people.
It's just after 9 p.m. A black man is driving his white Oldsmobile down the suburb's main street. It's still light out. The sun's just starting to go down, the tail end of a long summer day.
That stretch of road is the kind of road most people take to get somewhere else. It's just a few apartments and a golf course and a gate for the state fairgrounds. The man's girlfriend is in the passenger seat. Her 4-year-old daughter is buckled up in a car seat and bag. They've got a load of groceries. They're heading back from the store.
At 9:02 p.m., a police officer runs the plates
was pretty widely covered. It was an international story in our backyard. I was one of the reporters covering the shooting and the aftermath of the shooting with my colleague John Collins and other people in the newsroom. I worked at the time the early morning shift, so I came in around 6 in the morning to a very busy newsroom who had been watching what was happening all night long. There were protests all night long. People camped outside the governor's mansion. They marched in the middle of the night. Protesters were tired of seeing this happen in their community again. They wanted change. They were demanding police accountability and charges. And there was a Facebook Live video that played an important role in this whole incident. It's where the passenger in the car streamed the aftermath of the shooting live. So it brought people into the scene in real time. And what was happening, what usually happens after police shootings is the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension takes over and they investigate the case. They pass on the results of the investigation to the county attorney, and the county attorney then sends it to a grand jury, and the grand jury decides in secret to not indict or indict a police officer. So this story was different though. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if I was going to go to a grand jury or if the prosecutor would decide himself to bring charges or not. All we could do at the time was wait, but while we were waiting for the investigation to be done, which was about 4 months, we did some more digging on all the people involved. We wanted to keep following the story and not let it fall off our radar. We did some reporting on the Officer Geronimo Llanes, who attended school here, his work history and the police department that he worked for. We did reporting on Philando Castile, the driver, and kept in touch with his family. And we discovered that St. Anthony, the police department that the officer worked for, had disproportionately ticketed black drivers in the suburbs that it served. And we also learned that some members of the community had warned the previous chief about the racial disparities. So we did these stories, and that reporting came in really handy for the stories leading up to the investigation. We had a lot of context that we needed to really understand the story and tell the story fully. After the charges were announced in November, my colleague John Collins, who covered this as well, thought, wow, this case is actually going to trial. And that would make Officer Geronimo Llanes the first ever Minnesota police officer in any record that we know to face charges for shooting and killing someone while on duty. So he pitched a podcast to cover it. And we were at an advantage. We had the technical resources to do a podcast. We had a lot of tape already from all of our coverage. We did need more people to work on it with us. It was a big story and it was a big project to tackle. With my experience covering the stories that I had covered and his experience covering the story as well, John asked me to work on it with him, and we both learned a lot about the people that were involved, and we wanted to make something new. We wanted to cover the story in a different way, not just for the radio, but for the radio, for our website, and for new audiences of the podcast. It was an experiment, but how would we know if it would do well if we never tried it? So we tried it. It was different. Podcasts are different, a little bit different from radio stories. We do radio stories, but podcasts are different. As you heard in the promo clip that we have, or the beginning of it, the writing is slightly a different style of writing. There's a lot of scene setting with the writing. There's a lot of scene setting with the audio. There is room for the voices to breathe, which we don't typically have in a 4-minute radio story. There is music and scoring. You have to come up with a serialized and cohesive way to keep people coming back, a cohesive narrative to keep people coming back. Our goal was to introduce the characters and the stakes and then switch to breaking news mode during the trial to provide insight into the trial of a police officer. This was happening all over the country, so we knew a lot of people would be interested in this issue, and that's why it was worth the experiment. with something that we'd never done before. It had potential to attract new audiences and new listeners, not just from Minnesota, but from all over the country, which is exactly what happened in the end. So even though we were inspired by popular podcasts like Serial and the New York Times Daily, this one was different. We started out with 4 episodes that established the narrative arc. They told the story, they introduced us to the characters, they set up the trial, and then we switched to trial coverage, which was almost daily, putting out episodes when key witnesses would testify or something major would happen. So how did we do it? We did a lot of planning. It was a tight timeline. The charges were announced in November, and we obviously had the elections and so much other news going on that we had to cover. We didn't have capacity to jump on this right away. We didn't really start full-time until March, so we only had a couple months to really do this, and because the trial date was at the end of May. So it wasn't really a lot of time, like I said, to plan, write, edit, produce, and release the podcast by the time we wanted to launch, which was a week before the trial. It was a condensed timeline, but we squeezed a lot in. We had a lot of meetings. We talked big picture, small picture. What is the story really about? Why is it such a big story? What are the different elements of it? What are the possible outcomes? We tapped into other podcast makers for advice and our own colleagues at American Public Media who also make podcasts. Podcasting now is or podcast makers are kind of like their own little community, and they're willing to help each other out on something like this. So we picked people's brains a lot, and we learned from them, and we got advice on we learned about how they make their products, and they gave us advice on how we can make ours. We made a production calendar working backwards from the time that we wanted to launch to the present date at the time. We needed to schedule time for storyboarding, which is outlining all of the different elements of the story and the pieces that we had and the pieces that we still needed to get. We made a lot of lists at the time. What do we still need to go out and report? What do we have from all of the different audio that we were able to gather as a newsroom? And from there, we moved on to writing. And our writing process differed slightly for the initial episodes versus the trial episodes. For our initial episodes, we sat down in a room with our producer, Tracy Mumford, and talked about the story. What's the story that we want to tell? So for example, in episode 1, we wanted to tell the story of the victim, of the driver. And we needed to tell you what we knew about him and his last day. So this is an example of something that you can do with a podcast using the audio that we were able to gather from the immediate aftermath of the shooting to tell you the story of the victim.
I know he worked. He had a job. He kept a job. Anytime a young man keeps a job, I think he's a good kid. He's at New York now.
This is Sam Castile, Philando's grandfather.
That's me.
He's 90 years old, and the day after the shooting, his landline was ringing off the hook. News outlets from all over the country were trying to find out what they could about Philando. Our colleague Laura Ewan was sitting there with him in his living room as all this happened. Sam kept telling the callers all about Philando's job. He kept repeating the same things over and over to everyone who called.
Only thing I can tell you, his name was Philando Castile. He worked day in and day out. He never was in any trouble. He wasn't no criminal. He wasn't in no gang. Nothing like that.
What his grandpa is saying right there, that's something we hear a lot when black men are killed by police. Family members start listing all the reasons the person shouldn't have been killed.
He was a brave, good
loving young man.
They took a very good person.
He was a good guy.
He wasn't in any trouble.
Never been in trouble.
He wasn't in any trouble.
He's not a gangbanger. He's not a thug.
He wasn't a, gang member.
He's not in a gang.
He wasn't in a gang.
He wasn't one of those kids,
So we were able to gather the information that we thought was important to highlight in the different episodes that we put out. And this was an example of the things that we could include in the podcast. And here you can also see an example of the outline of episode 2, which was about the officer, Haran Moyanas. So we did the same thing with that episode as well. What do we know about him? What do we need to get? And we used a lot of public records. We tapped into people that he knew. We talked to his priest who married him. We talked to former high school friends. So we were able to get information on Officer Yanas even though he wasn't talking with us. And this was just an example of the different pieces that we had that we were trying to figure out how to incorporate into the episode in a nice narrative. And what we learned in the end was it was easier for us at the end of the day to go in chronological order, and it just made more sense to do it that way. And of course, after that, we edited. We had different editing processes. We edited with our immediate editor, and we also had what we call listening sessions, which are when we sit in a room, we read our scripts out loud as if we were performing it to the microphone and play our clips. And so we did this with a group of people, a group of our colleagues who are experienced radio listeners or podcast makers, and they gave us feedback and advice on what we needed to tweak and change to make it a better sounding story. And then it was really important for us to do fact-checking on something like this. It was it's always important to fact-check all of our work, but for this one, it was a longer piece, a longer project that we had a lot of information included in. So we spent a lot of time fact-checking and making sure that all of that information was accurate. We spent so much time on the first 4 episodes. The trial episodes to me seemed like a blur because so much was happening while we were covering it for all of the different platforms that we were doing for the radio, for the website, and for the podcast. So they seemed like a blur. But we actually had a lot of things happen during those trial episodes. When the trial started, we not only had to cover it, like I said, for the podcast and for the radio, but we had to cover it for all of the different platforms that we were committed to covering it in. So I would typically start my day by going to the studio and debriefing with the morning host and talk about what's coming up that day or that week. And then I would go to the courthouse and stand in a long line of reporters who were covering the story as well. It was getting a lot of national attention from all different news outlets. There's no audio or video recording in Minnesota courtrooms, so we had to rely on our voices recounting the stories and then rely on tape that we got from people outside of the courthouse, reaction tape. So those days that actually pretty much every day, we would use the short 10-minute breaks that we had to call our editors, tweet out what happened that morning or afternoon, get a drink of water, go to the bathroom. It wasn't a lot of time, so we had to squeeze a lot of it in, and it definitely helped to have 2 reporters covering this, one focusing on radio one day and the other focusing on digital needs, or vice versa. But it was like I said, it was really helpful to have multiple people working on this because there was a lot of surprises right away. Key witnesses testified immediately, and the dash cam footage of the incident, of the shooting, was released immediately. The trial itself wasn't as long as you would think when it's a high-profile case like this, but all in all, it took about 3 weeks. So what took most of the time was actually jury selection and jury deliberations at the end. So we figured it out, though. We had editors planning things out while we were covering it in the courtroom, and we figured out how to feed the immediate need of radio and plan the podcast. So I just wanted to play an example of how we kept our editors informed and when things happen in the courtroom.
Hey.
Hi there. Hi. Hang on, we gotta put headphones on. Oh, there's Meg.
Yeah, because you're far.
Hi, what's going on?
It's really hard to hear when everything is happening around me, so.
So what's up?
Yeah, surprisingly, just because the prosecution was just about to play the beginning interview with Officer Yanez, and the defense objected to it. And I had a brief conference at the bench, and the judge came back and said that they were going to recess for 20 minutes. He's under cross-examination at this point, and they wanted to play it during that time.
What have they been questioning him about so far?
Yeah, so far they've just been questioning him about just going through step by step that stuff. Doesn't remember looking at the insurance card when Castile handed him his insurance card, but he does remember very clearly when he told him, "Sir, I have to tell you I have a firearm on me." Then he was asked, "So what went through your mind when you started with firearm?" And he said, "Well, it changes the dynamics of the traffic stop, and puts the officer on high alert."
So this was just an example of giving our editors who aren't in the courtroom, they can't really keep up with what's happening minute by minute like we can, just giving them an incremental update on what was happening so they can be prepared for the day, so they can give the digital needs, or the digital team what they need to post on the website in terms of updating what's happening during the trial. And once in a while, they would use that information, they would use that audio from me or John on the radio as a soundbite during our all-day long newscast that we air. Meanwhile, the 74 Seconds team was prepping the podcast episodes, outlining it, using these updates that we would give throughout the day, and at the end of the day, we would put it all together into an episode when key witnesses would testify, like Officer Yanez. Like I said, there were some surprises. How fast the trial was kind of surprising, but we knew some things. We had an idea of what was going to happen. We knew Yanez was planning to testify in his own defense. We didn't know exactly when it was going to happen, so we just had to be prepared. Our producers helped us craft the episode that we put out when Yanez did testify, and I want you guys to listen to one clip from an earlier episode that we put out before the trial. It was about the traffic stop, what happened when the two men met, when Officer Yanez pulled over Philando Castile, and it describes that timeline. And then the other clip that I'm going to play is after the trial had started, something that came out during the trial. So just want you guys to listen for the similarities between the two.
So here's the stop, by the second.
Yanez turns on his squad car lights at 9:04 p.m.
The 74 seconds start ticking.
It takes Philando Castile 12 seconds to pull to the side of the road.
62 seconds to go.
Philando comes to a complete stop at the corner of Larpenteur and Fry, right in front of a sign for the Minnesota State Fair. He puts his car into park.
Yanez stops too. He gets out of his squad car.
Kauser arrives and gets out of his.
47 seconds to go.
Yanez takes lead, Kauser hangs back.
Officer Yanez approached Castile's vehicle on the driver's side.
That's John Choi, describing what happened.
Yanez could see both of Philando's hands as he approached.
He could smell weed, he said later.
Officer Yanez described Castile as initially having his left arm over the steering wheel with both hands in view.
Yanez puts his hand on his belt near his gun.
40 seconds to go.
Officer Yanez positioned himself facing the driver's side of the window, leaned his head forward, exchanged greetings with Castile, and informed him of his brake light problem.
And we got pulled over what allegedly was supposed to be a broken taillight. When he let us know that we had a broken taillight, he asked us, were we aware of it? We said no.
As Yanez is talking to Philando, Kauser approaches the other side of the Oldsmobile, stopping near the back passenger door. 29 seconds to go.
Officer Yanez asked Castile to produce his driver's license and proof of insurance.
24 seconds.
Castile first provided him with his insurance card.
14 seconds.
Yanez looks at the insurance card. He puts it in his pocket. He still needs to see ID.
My boyfriend carries all his information in a thick wallet in his right side back pocket.
10 seconds.
Castile then calmly and in a non-threatening manner informed Officer Yanez, "Sir, I have to tell you that I do have a firearm on me."
As he's reaching for his back pocket wallet, he lets the officer know, "Officer, I have a firearm on me."
7 seconds.
Before Castile completed the sentence, Officer Yanez interrupted and calmly replied, "Okay," and placed his right hand on the holster of his own holstered gun. Officer Yanez then said, "Okay, don't reach for it then." Castile tried to respond, but was interrupted by Officer Yanez, who said, "Don't pull it out." Castile responded, "I'm not pulling it out." And Reynolds also responded by saying, "He's not pulling it out."
I began to yell, "But he's licensed to carry."
Then Officer Yanez screamed, "Don't pull it out," and quickly pulled his own gun with his right hand while he reached inside the driver's side window with his left hand. Officer Yanez pulled his left arm out of the car and then fired 7 shots in rapid succession into the vehicle.
After that, he began to take off shots. Don't move, don't move.
So this is the second clip that we released as part of an episode that came out during the trial when Officer Yanez testified.
So we're down to the final 7 seconds of the stop now. And everything Yanez said today matches what we already knew. But these next 7 seconds, they are the most important 7 seconds of the entire stop. Because Yanez, he now knows that there's a gun in the car, and something is about to happen that causes him to believe that he's under threat. A big enough threat to pull his gun and fire. So today, on the stand, what did he say happened?
He says he saw the gun.
So you can hear in the earlier episode, we told the story from public records, from what we knew from the prosecutor, John Choi, from what we knew from the witness, Diamond Reynolds, and in the second clip, during the trial, this is what we knew from Yanez's perspective. It was a perspective that we had never heard before. So you can hear in the music and the scoring, you can hear a little bit of the similarity in there. They're short clips, but throughout the whole episodes, you can really hear how we mirrored that, the earlier episode with the later episode, because we're talking about the same thing. They're just from different perspectives. So all in all, we put out a total of 22 episodes, and we got 1.5 million downloads. It was a pleasant surprise to hear that we had that many downloads. I was really proud of the variety of episodes that the team was able to release. We put out episodes about the opening statements, closing statements, the release of the dashcam video, which people were anticipating for a really long time. We contextualized things. We had experts on who contextualized and analyzed the news. We had jury selection, we had closing statements, and the aftermath of the trial, the verdict, obviously, and what happens after that. It was nice. What was nice about covering a story like this in a podcast format was being able to contextualize and the legal aspects of the trial and really explain the complexities of the system. We heard from a lot of people who told us that that was really helpful for them to understand the legal system in Minnesota. For example, we had an episode during jury selection about what is it like to select a fair and impartial jury when it's a high-profile case like this, and what does it mean to have a hung jury? This was during jury deliberations. So people really cared about the story when they heard the first few episodes, and they stuck with us throughout the trial. I was talking to our producer, Tracy, about this recently, and she put it this way. She said, the first 4 episodes were like chapter 1 of the story. The trial episodes were like chapter 2, and then the aftermath episodes were chapter 3. So with that, I will take your questions. Go ahead.
You know, you add music to podcasts. Well, I'm from a news background. We've had a little bit. My background is in journalism as well. So when you tell a story, it's basically the facts. When you add music, you make it into a production, into like almost a movie or something. So you're creating a mood. How do you decide what mood to create? Because you are essentially creating that mood with that music, which may or not be what was actually taking place.
I think for this story, it was a tough story for everyone involved, and we didn't really have to really make editorial decisions. It was pretty obvious which moments music was appropriate in. And
music, where do you get that music from?
We had a composer for this project. We had a composer.
Somebody write special music for them?
Right, we did. Yeah, we did. We wanted something appropriate. We wanted something to go with the story and something that doesn't really exploit anything. And we had to choose the right placement for it.
But it kind of does exploit in a way, I think, because it's actually creating a mood that isn't necessarily what actually happened in that place, because you're creating it. So
I think it makes it.
As a news person at all?
Yeah, I think it makes it more engaging. And our goal wasn't, it's not really. It's just to highlight the moments and not to really exploit or, yeah. Do you have a question? Oh.
What are some of the podcasts that you listen to and that you enjoy yourself, and also that you maybe took some direction from doing this? You mentioned Serial.
Yeah.
Are there other ones?
I mean, Serial is kind of the big one, right? That a lot of people are inspired by. The Daily podcast from the New York Times, because they do breaking news mode. I personally like Embedded by NPR because I like the production value, I like the reporting, I like the narrative, and I listen to Reveal, a whole bunch of different ones. I was talking about More Perfect earlier today. So just kind of the podcasts that tell you a story and that you can hear really strong production value in. I really appreciate those.
Everything you described that goes into that sounds really labor intensive. Do you have like an estimate of like how many hours go into a podcast episode? All the work that needs to go on.
Yeah, I think we were talking about this earlier today. If we can put a number of hours on it, and I can't count how many hours we put in this, but it may, like 10% of the hours are actually the length of time of audio that's released. 10% of the labor that is put in, I think, would be my estimate. But we did put in a lot of time in this, and we wanted to do it right. We didn't want to rush it. We didn't want to put out something that wasn't good.
Was there some worry about doing the dailies during the trial? I think with Serial, the first season of that was so successful, and then the second season,
because there was news.
Ongoing case with the bird same way, where the other one was such a
Yeah.
intriguing mystery. Did you worry a little bit that once you had those first 4 in the can, that once you started doing them daily, that how those would fit with that?
Like switching kind of style a little bit?
Knowing that, you had probably a lot of time to do the work for those first 4, where those other ones were going to be
Crunched.
You want to get them up as quickly as possible, I assume.
Right, we did. We made sure that people's expectations were clear. We told them in the beginning that this is going to be, we're going to tell you the story, and then we're going to take you into the courtroom, and we're going to give you updates all the time. So I think people were expecting that, and they stuck with us. We had one episode right when the trial started to introduce people to the trial and what was happening the first couple days, which wasn't a lot. It was jury selection, so we had a little bit of time to do that, and they were expecting it. We made it clear what we were going to do.
How long are the episodes?
They range from 15 to 25 minutes, 30 minutes. So I think they're pretty ideal for commute time, and we also didn't want to overdo it. Like, we didn't want to put in tape just because we had tape. We were very selective in the tape that we included. If it was important enough to include, we included it. If it was something that doesn't add anything, then we didn't include it.
Because we're at a university, there's probably many aspiring journalists in this room. Does NPR offer internships, and did you have any interns helping and work on this particular production that you did?
NPR does offer internships, but I don't know about the program, like what the requirements of the program are, if it's specific schools. We didn't have an intern working on it. We did have a production assistant who helped us with some of the tape. Yeah.
So if there are aspiring journalists or storytellers in this room, which I hope there are, what are some things they should be doing now? Because, like the tools of the trade change so quickly, and I can see where something like this maybe seems overwhelming. They think, oh, I have to be an audio perfectionist or something, but, what can they be doing now to kind of keep up with this fluid environment?
I think a recorder, there are some pretty affordable recorders out there now, and getting a recorder and being able to record your interviews, which is important to do anyway, so you have a record of it, that would be really useful. Like we were talking earlier with the reporter for the student paper, if you are doing a story, an important story on campus, and you're getting tape, then maybe if you're thinking about putting out a podcast, you can use that tape for the podcast, even if it's a simple Q&A with the reporter, what's happening, and then playing some of that tape. So I think maybe just starting out with a piece of equipment that would help you gather audio, and get audio everywhere you go. You never know, when your recorder is on, you never know what you're going to encounter and what you're going to capture. And then also just teaching yourself how to edit and produce. There's a lot of good tutorials on YouTube and just online. If you know someone and if you're able to network with people who are able to help you get some training on some of that programming and that equipment, it would be really useful. And our phones can do a lot now, so we're able to do, if my equipment fails, I can always use my phone to send audio back in an immediate situation. So they're sometimes a lot easier to do that than having to plug in your bulky equipment. So just experiment with all kinds of different things, and I think it's really important to learn all different aspects: writing, photography, audio recording, video recording. It's really helpful.
You don't have to give away any MPR secrets or anything like that, but are there some more podcasts that
we have a podcast unit that does some amazing work, so I would check them out with APM Reports is working on something, so I would check that out. But you never know. Just keep listening and keep following, and you'll hear about something if there's something.
I'm Dave from the Department of Communication Studies.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Years ago, we had Sasha Islami, and
oh, did you?
Stage here talking to you, but if you don't mind me saying this, Karen might not say this, but Karen right over there from KMSU Radio, many students are interested in audio. I love audio work. The Southern Minnesota Youth Project, you can work with that program and learn a lot of audio production and put things on the air here locally and moving toward this level, which is really beautiful work.
I think audio is really intimate. You hear things in it that you just get a different sense from audio than you do reading an article in the paper. So,
And we are looking for reporters at KMSU Radio. So everybody can stop out. I appreciate it. Thanks, Dave.
Well, this looks good, so thank you so much.
thank you.